There are few stories quite as disturbing as No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. It is a dark and horrific tale of personal tragedy, trauma, despair, loneliness, and self-destruction, made all the more moving by the fact that it is semi-autobiographical. It is also one of the most penetrating psychological novels ever written, and by reading it, you will gain a deeper understanding of the more troubling parts of your own mind. It follows a young man named Obayozo, who lives his entire life with this strange sense that he is in some way deeply unlike other people, that he is therefore not fully human. It's a feeling that I think a troubling number of people can relate to in one way or another, and so it's exactly what I want to explore today. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. A Life of Pretense. I've spoken about this on the channel before, but some of my favourite books to just skim through on a rainy day are the letters and diaries of Franz Kafka. In them, we reveal a man who is totally terrified of other people and their judgment, almost to the point of pathology. Most people who read these diaries assume that Kafka must have been a solemn or solitary figure in his everyday life. But nothing could be further from the truth. Reports from his friends paint him as pretty sociable and good-humoured, and there are even accounts of him laughing with those friends about what he was writing. All the while, we know how insecure he felt about this very writing. The picture painted by much of Kafka's diaries is of a man living somewhat of a double life. But he was not hiding some secret family or a grave conspiracy. He was just hiding most of himself from the world. We only see a few glimpses of this diary Kafka in his letters, and it's often only in fits of written panic. When reading No Longer Human, I couldn't help but be reminded of this strange dynamic. Our protagonist, Obayozo, is defined by a separation between himself and other people, and he intensely feels the eyes of those other people upon him. This is even reflected in the very first line of Oba's notebook. Mine has been a life of much shame. But what is the ultimate origin of this shame? Well, it's partly because he finds other people really confusing, as if they're of a slightly different breed to him. This is one meaning of the title. While I've chosen to use its more popular translation as No Longer Human, many have pointed out that it is probably better rendered as disqualified from humanity, since there's no point in the book where Oba does feel like he is a proper human. This disqualification begins as bafflement, but then morphs into fear. Oba can only see other humans as a kind of confusing threat. It's not exactly clear where he picked up this habit, but it may have been through being tragically and horribly assaulted by some of his family's servants. But Oba's diaries suggest that it predates even this. He begins to view other people not as differentiated individuals, but as a sort of large, eldritch, singular beast, with the ability to cause him great harm if it so desired. As a result, he becomes terribly frightened of the other. And while we're on the subject of confusion, disconnection, and disorientation, if you want to make more sense of the world around you, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on Elon Musk threatening to support the opponents of those who vote for Trump's upcoming budget. While left-wing sources focused on the threat this posed to Trump, right-wing sources tended to frame this decision in negative terms, calling the move incendiary. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing an economist with a positive appraisal of Trump's tariff policies, or right-wing sources missing the potential 12 million people that might lose their health coverage under Trump's budget. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So receiving my ground news roundup at the end of every day means that I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and just make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News are giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've become my go-to news source, and I really hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. But it is the specific character of the terror that I find most interesting, because I think it hits upon something that quite a lot of us probably feel from time to time, but struggle to put into words. Ober is not just scared of judgment or punishment. He is afraid of being found out. This sense of separation he has from others becomes a sort of secret guilt that he can't quite shake. Themes of guilt are, incidentally, a huge through line in Osamu Dazai's work, and we see it again in one of his other fantastic books, The Setting Sun. In this case, it transforms Ober's entire childhood into one big protective pretense. As he puts it, I have always shook with fright before human beings, unable as I was to feel the least particle of confidence in my ability to speak and act like a human being. I kept my solitary agonies locked in my breast. Here, we see the first step towards Ober's gradual alienation from both himself and humankind. It starts with this secret feeling that he is already isolated from other people and could never truly understand them. As a reader, I can't help but wonder whether Ober truly is completely different to the people around him, or whether he simply becomes more different over time. Because Ober's proposed solution to this perceived separation would only make it worse, and in fact, does only make it worse. He does what can seem so natural to do if you are deeply afraid of showing yourself to others. He adopts a mask, and just like Kafka, his mask is quite comic in nature. He says that his chosen character is a jester, and describes it as a role born of desperation. His aim is rather simple. He wants to make people laugh, since then he is pretty sure that they won't feel motivated to hurt him, and he will ultimately pass for one of them. His secret safe at last. However, we can immediately see how this situation has set Ober up for misery. He has now geared his entire life towards making other people happy and avoiding their gaze. Of course, there's nothing wrong with serving others, but this pathological wish that Ober has to keep others pleased at all times with his performance makes his life a perpetually tense game of cat and mouse. Having decided on the performance because he felt he had something to hide, now Ober actually does have something to hide. He's put himself in the very situation he was trying to avoid, and has also made other people the sole determiner of his feelings. There is one particular episode that illustrates this absolutely perfectly. Ober's father is visiting Tokyo, and he asks his children what they would like as a gift while he's there. Ober finds himself totally paralyzed, as he can't think what his character would say in that situation. We can note already how Ober has begun to detach himself from his own being and his own wants. In response to a simple question about what he desires, he searches for what his jester persona would want instead. When this comes up short, and Ober's father expresses even the mildest bit of disappointment, it throws Ober into a spin. In a particularly telling passage, he says the following: "What a failure! Now I had angered my father, and I could be sure that his revenge would be something fearful." Of course, from an outside perspective, this is a deeply weird thing to think. Nothing Ober has said about his father makes it sound like he would take some spectacular revenge on child Ober, but he has become so fearful of other people as a whole that he imagines there will be some great reckoning should he ever fail in his performance. Ober's internal sense of guilt and deception makes him see persecution where none is really there, and this only cements his fear of the outside world even further. The treatment has become the disease. A further danger of this is that Ober does not even seem particularly fulfilled when the performance is going well. Although he regards the times that he makes others laugh as a triumph, and he takes some kind of pride in them, he seems more relieved than happy about it. He still lives with this permanent terror that his act will falter, and he will eventually be found out. This only makes sense, considering that any time someone praises him or expresses love towards him or helps him, they're only doing those things to the character he's performing, rather than Ober himself. In other words, wearing this persona has done nothing to alleviate his disconnection from humanity, and if anything, it's merely cemented it. It hasn't done a thing to assuage his terror of other people either, but it's only given him more reason to be scared. Even as a child, he has a very jaded view of other people and of humanity as a whole, saying, "To appeal for help to any human being, I could expect nothing from that expedient." This means that he never turns to anyone, even when he is violated by the family servants. Already, Ober is something of a tragic figure. He has a deep cynicism with the outside world, combined with a deep inner fear, and this places a thick wedge between himself and anyone else. Saddest of all, he feels so alone and so isolated that he feels he can't turn to anyone when he undergoes an unimaginable torment that no child should have to suffer. But perhaps Ober's most interesting observation is that he is just taking to extremes what others do for a large proportion of their lives anyway. He notices this hypocrisy that constantly manifests in general life, the undercurrent of deceit that keeps society's gears spinning, and he considers his act just another part of this machine. In fact, the only difference he sees is that he is aware that he is lying, whereas others drift along in blissful ignorance of their own lies. Implicitly, there's an accusation in there for us as well. The fascinating thing about Ober here is that he's not getting on some kind of moral high horse. He recognizes that such deceit may even be necessary for the good of all, but at the same time, his particular instance of it is so clearly making him a frightened, miserable wreck. Contained within this tension is a question that has no easy answer. When, truly, should we be honest? What should we do with the parts of ourselves that we feel ashamed to show to others? On the one hand, Ober recognizes that a society of total honesty would not stand, and he could not get by on this either. We need those little deceptions to prevent conflict or promote social cohesion. On the other, Ober's pretense is clearly tearing him apart inside and granting him a profound sort of loneliness. But are we really so sure that we are so different from him? What parts of ourselves do we keep totally hidden from others, ashamed for them to see the light of day? And how do we think they would be received if we showed them openly? To what extent are we too simply a pretense? I sometimes see people interpret No Longer Human as arguing for total authenticity, that we should display ourselves to the world totally unadorned by any kind of pretense. But Ober's observations reveal something a little bit more complex. It shows that deceit and honesty both have their contextual strengths and weaknesses, and that there are, in fact, no easy solutions to the problem of human authenticity. A fitting thought for an author that was himself so very tortured. But next, let's move on to one primary result of Ober's constant acting: his total frustration with self-expression. 2. Expression, coping, and self-hate. The idea of self-expression is such a nebulous concept and can seem really wooey, for want of a better word. And yet, at the same time, most of us recognize it as deeply important at some level. While the idea of specifically artistic self-expression strikes a lot of people as highfalutin, it is in some ways just an extension of the same general will to self-expression that drives almost everyone's wish to speak freely with the people around them, for instance. This is one reason why we flock to others around whom we can express ourselves without restraint. Frustrated self-expression has often been linked empirically to reduced well-being, as well as an increase in depressive tendencies. Interestingly, a study I found by Larson et al. Also linked depressive tendencies to further self-repression, at least in adolescence, suggesting that this could become some kind of vicious cycle. Whether or not findings like these are totally generalizable, they certainly hold true for Oba himself. One of the few moments of joy that we see in the entire book is when he is painting in his childhood years with a friend who he nonetheless considers stupid and contemptible, Takechi. He crafts what he calls self-portraits, where he displays all these aspects of himself that he hides in public on the canvas. It is quite telling that this is probably the high point of Oba's mental state in the novel, and it's also one of the only points where he lets his mask slip in a controlled fashion, though he also says that he will never let people see these as he fears how they will react. He is still deeply torn between this wish to have other people really know him and a fear of the consequences of expressing himself. As he puts it, "Naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone except Takechi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might imagine that it was just some new twist to my clowning. This would have been most painful of all." For Oba, the only thing worse than people condemning him for who he is people never taking him seriously at all. The only person he shows them to, Takechi, he feels safe around precisely because he never considers him a full human being. Oba is in a classic catch-22. But even this expressive outlet is tragically short-lived. Soon, Oba is off to college, where he does initially join a local art class and throws himself into some of his artworks, but he is soon waylaid by other methods to cope with this feeling of estrangement from the world. He begins drinking heavily and frequenting ladies of the night, and he describes all of this in terms of an escape. It is here where we have one of our first real cases of deeply unreliable narration. In his notebooks, Oba pins the motivation for his escapes purely on his dread of other people. But we know that's not quite true, because it's not like he feels at peace when he's alone. He describes a night in his dorm room as follows: "It terrified me to sit by myself quietly in my room. I felt frightened, as if I might be set upon or struck by someone at any moment." Although he again paints this as fear of the other, his response is to rush out and spend time with other people or get drunk with Hariki, a strange ne'er-do-well companion that he's picked up. This heavily suggests that he is not just scared of others, but is slowly viewing himself as unbearable to be around. This is reflected in how he talks about his persona as well. Whereas in his childhood, he still referred to his clowning as a triumph, even if a bit of a hollow one, he now views it as pathetic that he can't express his real feelings or talk in his own voice. He refers to his antics as a buffoonery of defeat. This marks a vital stage in Oba's downward spiral. Before, he was pretending, but he always did this with an air of superiority and a certain self-esteem. He conceived of himself as almost a bit of an evil genius, a realpolitik mastermind able to twist those around him to his will. At this point, he no longer thinks any of this. If before he was alienated from others, now he is just as alienated from himself. His attitude towards the mask has changed from protection to real frustration. Although he seems to not explicitly know it, Oba has come to view himself as a kind of undesirable object, something that he is saddled with rather than something that he is. Thus, when he escapes into these intoxicating habits, he is partly attempting to escape himself. It is the only time in his life where he is dulled enough not to feel this total self-contempt. Eventually, this wish to escape himself reaches its logical conclusion, and he does attempt to end his own existence. He ultimately fails, but this just shows how far the character has gone. He has become so hateful of who he is that he can't stand to be in his own presence for a single second longer. We'll come back to this episode in the next section when we look at Oba's attitude to love, because he was not alone here. I wanted to talk about this effect that frustrated self-expression has on Oba because, just like the last section, I suspect that low levels of his behavior are probably pretty visible in most of us. Not necessarily the total spirals of self-destruction, but that gradual chipping away at our own self-perception that inevitably happens when we refuse, day after day, to make decisions that reflect the kind of person we want to be, rather than a projected protective persona. It would be totally simplistic to just say, right, okay, let's all just express ourselves, man. Because self-expression is, to a certain extent, a luxury. No one can express themselves fully in every situation, or else they would probably find themselves completely at odds with the people around them. For example, no one can fully express themselves in a workplace without provoking the ire of their boss. However, the example of Oba's painting gives us a certain food for thought. There, Oba had a place he felt he could express himself safely and freely. Despite his terror in almost every other aspect of his life, he felt at home in these paintings. It's only when he's deprived of even this private sort of self-expression that he really begins to spiral. It may have also provided him just enough room to express himself that he didn't feel quite so pathetic or boxed in by his persona. Although I do think that total self-expression is a bit of a pipe dream, and I really do think it would be a societal disaster at scale, we ought not to fall into the trap of thinking that self-expression is unimportant, or that it can merely be brushed aside as an ephemeral concern. We need somewhere where we can express ourselves, and thus somewhere that feels like home. On another note, Oba's feelings of inner shame and patheticness is itself deeply interesting. You could look at it in two ways. On the one hand, it could just stem from this frustrated self-expression. Oba is in a constant state of self-betrayal, and so he doesn't recognize himself as worth all that much. All he has is this mirage he's constructed, and he despises that for having to wear it, and himself for choosing to do so. On the other, it could be that he hates himself for his lack of courage, for constantly feeling so afraid that time and time again he does choose to wear this persona despite secretly wishing that he were brave enough for it to be revealed. Either way, by the time he is into adulthood, Oba feels totally and utterly disoriented and disconnected. He is so in the habit of pretending that even if he wanted to, he could not drop the act, and this places him at one step remove from his entire life. He describes this feeling as dread, but in a lot of ways, his behavior manifests this strange mixture of apathy and frustration. In other words, exactly what we would expect if Oba is struggling internally between a wish to express himself and a near inability to work out what self-expression or who he is even mean anymore. But next, I want to expand our analysis ever so slightly. So far, we've been roughly treating Oba as if he were a totally lone agent. But in fact, he encounters many different people throughout the book, and his detachment colors his relationship to all of them. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of the channel's wonderful supporters on Patreon. The link is in the description. 3. An inability to love. I feel like I bring this quote up constantly, but one of my favorite lines in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov is spoken by the elder Zosima, and is simply, "Hell, I maintain, is the inability to love." The active verb here is so important. It is not just the inability to be loved that Zosima says is hell, although he would certainly view that as deeply unpleasant. It is the inability to give love. And love, for Dostoevsky and also for Zosima, is a kind of self-sacrifice. To wish the good of the other, even at the expense of yourself. Zosima views love as a potentially terrifying force that will involve offering up parts of you for the sake of this beloved person. Yet the only thing worse than this is having nothing and no one to sacrifice for. I know that Osamu Dazai did read Dostoevsky, so I wonder if he had the elder Zosima in mind when Oba Yozo says the following. "I know that I am liked by other people, but I seem to be deficient in the faculty to love others. I should add that I have very strong doubts as to whether even human beings really possess this faculty." At some level, I think that Oba is correct about himself here. He does face a real inability to love, though it's not because he is particularly malicious or spiteful. It is just that he's become such a spectator in his own life and feels so generally disconnected that I'm not sure he would even recognize his own feelings of love or know if he had a genuine wish to sacrifice for another person, nor would he fully be able to recognize the love of other people. Firstly, we see this disconnection with a few girls that just take a fancy to Oba because we're told he is very handsome. He feels like he cannot refuse them and spends time with them while desperately wanting to be anywhere else. He is so terrified of displeasing anyone that he just can't turn them down. At this point, we've not yet seen his inability to love, but just that his general disconnection with the world and total lack of agency in it definitely does translate to this sphere of love and romance, and certainly for the worst. He does suffer from these unwanted attachments. There are a few characters that end up as developed love interests for Oba, and how he treats them is, it's fair to say, pretty telling. I feel like this is where a lot of readers probably stop liking Oba, as he drags more and more people into his precipitous downward spiral. But it's still very interesting how Dazai paints this process. First, there is Tsuneko. This is a bartender that Oba meets, and is also the first person that he feels he can be himself around, who he also thinks of as a full person, unlike some of his childhood attachments. When we first meet her, this truly seems like it will be a breakthrough for Oba, and yet he immediately runs from her and does not see her for a month, with the following rather revealing admission. The weak fear happiness itself. They can harm themselves on cotton wool. Sometimes they are wounded even by happiness. I was impatient to leave her while things still stood the same, before I got wounded, and I spread my usual smokescreen of farce. That is, Oba is so disconnected from himself and from the ability to behave with even a shred of natural honesty that even when confronted with someone who does bring out what he is really feeling, he can feel the pull of his own persona tugging at him. I also suspect that he may be so unused to being himself that he finds the very notion disturbing. It puts him on the back foot, hence his fear of happiness itself. He feels he can't let Tsuneko get close to him, even describing himself as frightened that he'd let her be even a little bit kind to him. The second time that they meet, it's clear that Tsuneko herself is in deep misery, as she suggests that they jump into the sea together and drown. At this point, anyone who truly loved or felt affection for her would almost certainly try to persuade her out of this terrible course of action. But Oba agrees almost immediately. Yet she dies and he survives. When he wakes up at the hospital, we get the following line. I thought of the dead Tsuneko, and longing for her, I wept. Of all the people I had ever known, that miserable Tsuneko really was the only one I loved. In some sense, I am sure that Oba is expressing a real feeling here, but at the same time, it's hard not to be somewhat skeptical of his words. After all, if you love someone, you don't encourage or agree to their death. And I think that this marks yet another turning point in Oba's journey. Before, he was a sort of quite solitary, miserable figure. Someone who did hurt deeply, but ultimately still mainly hurt themselves. Much of the second half of the book is taken up by Oba hurting almost all of the people he professes to care about. And in this, I think we get a uniquely unflinching look at a part of human misery that we often try not to discuss in polite society. When you are truly miserable, you can easily catch other people in your self-destructive spiral. Oba begins to demonstrate this troublingly familiar selfishness that has a tendency to visit us when we are truly in despair. This episode with Tsuneko is hardly an isolated incident. He has similar romantic flings with other women, most of whom he treats pretty terribly and takes advantage of their kindness or generosity. All the while, he wallows in his misery and doesn't really give them a shred of support. It's not that he is setting out to be malicious or cruel. It's more like his general misery and disconnection has narrowed his vision, so that he doesn't really register the hurt that he's causing others. His standard pattern is to stay with someone for a while, slowly make their life worse, suddenly realize this in a flash of inspiration, and then leave without even saying goodbye, which probably only made them feel abandoned. He has this nasty habit of taking others for a ride, even when he doesn't consciously mean to. This culminates in the way that Oba treats a young woman called Yoshiko. He marries her on a whim, not really thinking about her at all, but rather whatever joy he perceives he will get out of this union. He then spends their marriage deceiving her and almost leeching off her. He doesn't even defend her when she is horrifically assaulted, and after that point, he all but abandons her to drinking morphine and extramarital affairs. This is probably the apotheosis of Ober's despair-induced egoism. He just doesn't have the internal resources to care about another person in a proper, active way, even if he wanted to. Ironically, through all of this time, Ober has been curiously kept afloat by the strange kindness of a man he calls Flatfish because his face looks a bit like a flatfish, with some help from Ober's father. In fact, the entire book, and especially this part of it, is filled with people showing Ober small acts of kindness to help him along, and even quite large ones. There's the madam of a bar he frequents, who gives him a place to stay with Yoshiko. There is another woman that he stays with for a while, who finds him work, and even trusts him to look after her young child. After a stay at a mental institution, he's visited by his brother, who agrees to support him financially so long as Ober gets out of Tokyo and so has a fighting chance at a better life. Ober can't seem to recognize these acts of kindness that are paid to him, however, and either doesn't notice them or, in some cases, reacts with pretty open hostility towards them. And maybe this is the saddest part of Ober's tale, because if we read between the lines, we find that a lot of people truly do love Ober in a strange way. At the very least, they are more than willing to sacrifice for him or go out of their way to help him. But he just can't see this. Ober's perception of the world is that he is permanently divorced from humankind. But reading the novel, this is mostly Ober's self-fulfilling prophecy. He approaches life under the axiom that everyone is a hostile force in some way, shape, or form, and so he finds himself both incapable of loving others and incapable of recognizing the love other people give to him. And this ends up destroying not just him, but also so many of the people who were so painfully desperate to help him. And I want to end by exploring this final theme a little bit further, the unreliable narration of Ober Yozo, because I think that it offers some of the most insightful ideas in the whole book. 4. Disqualified from reality. Away into the book, Ober gives us the following observation. Is it not true that no two human beings understand anything whatsoever about each other? That those who consider themselves bosom friends may be utterly mistaken about their fellow, and, failing to realize this sad truth throughout a lifetime, weep when they read in the newspapers about his death. This amounts to a pretty thorough skepticism about the ability of people to know one another and know what one another are thinking in any capacity. I want to bear this in mind because, in many ways, Ober totally fails to apply this observation to himself. In the epilogue to the book, we follow a different character who, diegetically, is the person who's received and is now publishing Ober's notebooks. He tracks down the madam from the bar that Ober used to go to, the one who provided him with some lodgings, and asks her about Ober. She says this: "It's his father's fault. The Yozo we knew was so easygoing and amusing, and if only he hadn't drunk. No, even though he did drink, he was a good boy and an angel." Setting aside the comment about the father, as the madam had never encountered the father, this suggests that there truly was a huge gulf between how Ober perceived himself and how the people around him perceived him. Throughout the narration, Ober doesn't just perceive himself to be pathetic and guilty, he thinks that other people can sense that as well, or at the very least would feel that if they at any point saw past his mask. It's pretty telling that he describes himself as relieved when he is literally being interrogated at the police station by a police officer and may go to prison. He feels that that is where he belongs, and he narrates all of his actions accordingly. But how reliable really is he if we get this report from the madam, who has seen some of his worst antics and heard some of his worst behavior, still defending him as an angel? Is it possible that he was wrong about himself? Not just that he was not really some separate species to the human race, but that even in his adult life, which he paints as one great, shameful train ride to hell, things did not happen as he said they did. I just love how much this ending sows doubt upon Ober's account of his own life, because it mirrors the tragedy that Oba has been going through over and over again since he was a child. On the one hand, he is afraid of being known, and on the other, he is afraid of never being known at all. Think back to how he felt about his self-portraits, and how the only thing worse than people rejecting this real act of self-expression would be them thinking it was just another part of his joke. How the only thing worse than being understood would be if no one ever saw through this mask. Faced with the testimony of the madam, we are confronted with some pretty significant questions. We have a few options here. The first is that Oba truly did succeed totally in his act. Just as he planned it, he managed to fool the people around him so completely that even exposed to his worst actions, they thought he was an angel. The second is that the madam saw Oba for who he was, or roughly who he was, and decided to show him kindness anyway and see the good within him. In which case, we know that Oba was wrong to think that others were truly a hostile force. The third is that Oba was just deeply wrong about himself. That in fact, there was no evil Oba within him for him to feel so very guilty about. That when push came to shove, Oba had no need for all of this shame. And the way he describes himself in his journals as this careless, detached disaster who takes advantage of others and refuses to help anyone was false all along. Maybe events with Tsuneko or Yoshiko just didn't occur as he described them, and they were all reinterpreted and distorted through this aggressively self-condemnatory lens. In which case, he fled from others for no real reason, and spent his entire life in this hole of isolation and self-hate for nothing. Either way, we get to one of the key questions asked in Dazai's book. What does it mean for Oba to be no longer human, or disqualified from humanity? Was this something that Oba drew himself towards? Was it the result of being traumatized as a child? Was it a part of his natural constitution? Was it some combination of these factors? Or was it that at no point did Oba become no longer human, but rather he tortured himself with a twisted self-image for so long that it made him miserable in almost every circumstance? We will ultimately never know. Although it's worth noting that all of these possibilities end in exactly the same way for Oba. They cast him into despair and make him feel totally and utterly disconnected, both from his fellow man and his own respect. There is one passage that really stands out for me, as it really illustrates the final nail in the coffin for Oba's mental state. Reflecting on his general view of the world, he says this: "I was frightened even by God. I could not believe in his love, only in his punishment. I could believe in hell, but it was impossible for me to believe in the existence of heaven." In context, what Oba is rejecting here is a possibility of redemption. In his mind, there is no real chance for wiping away his old sins. He might improve on his behavior, but he will never consider himself forgiven for anything he has done and anything that he is. Oba jealously guards his own trespasses and will not let a single one of them go. As a result, all of his self-perceived patheticness compiles into a list of unforgettable wrongs. Incidentally, this is the very factor that causes him to keep hurting people and to keep betraying himself by keeping up this perpetual act and only making himself more miserable. Forgiveness and redemption are tricky things to talk about. Someone like Oba, who has genuinely caused an awful lot of anguish for the people around him, also damns himself further by never believing that he could be forgiven. Oba largely becomes so destructive because he just can't conceive of a way in which he could be anything other than this. And even if he did undergo such a change, so what? He's already far too far gone in his own eyes for it to ever be worth it. As this is a semi-autobiographical work, it's worth noting that Osamu Dazai himself never recovered from his despair. To that extent, it's not surprising that No Longer Human leaves the reader with hundreds of questions and almost no answers. It is, at its core, one person's failed journey to find his sense of humanity and solidarity with other people, his sense of personal purpose and dignity, and his perceived wretchedness and inability to love. To read it is to get a chillingly vulnerable account of not only the depths of human misery, but all the hurt that you can cause others while you are down there. And in the end, a key thought lingers in the air. Could Ober be redeemed? And if so, how? At the very least, for anyone who currently feels disconnected from humanity or alienated from themselves, it gives a pretty stark warning about one deeply flawed way to approach it. By looking at Ober's failure, we can better understand how we might want to view our own feelings of isolation and how we might want to treat them. But if you want to look at a book with some quite similar themes, you can check out my video on Dostoevsky's chilling work, Notes from Underground, right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.